And first and last time this shirt's gonna be relevant. I don't think it's actually a reference to the band, but, it's got their name on it. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for another worst to best ranking. So, we're finally doing another one of these off-brand ranking videos, breaking away from my usual format, which ordinarily focuses exclusively on electronic music, to talk about a really old psych rock and sort of prog band I have a long personal history with. Having already done videos going through the catalogs of Yes and Pink Floyd, I've hinted for a while that I've also wanted to do a similar video breaking down the catalog of the Moody Blues, probably best known as a 5-piece outfit consisting of Graham Edge on drums, R.I.P., Mike Pinder on keyboards, also R.I.P., John Lodge on bass, Justin Hayward on guitar, and Ray Thomas on a number of other different instruments, including flute and saxophone and other things, also R.I.P. All 5 of them contributed vocals and songwriting regularly. I think Justin Hayward was the most common lead vocalist for the band, although it's pretty close. And there's been other members, like how in the early formative days of the band they started with vocalist Denny Lane and bassist Clint Warwick on board before Lodge or Hayward joined, R.I.P. to both of them as well. And later in their history, Mike Pinder left the band to be replaced by keyboardist Patrick Moraz. I have been sitting on this script so long that 2 of those deaths happened after I started writing this video. Jesus. Now, everybody and their mom already knows Pink Floyd, and a band like Yes are pretty ubiquitous in their particular field as well, but the Moody Blues don't have nearly the same notoriety. I mean, they're far from unknown. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018, and they've had plenty of big Billboard Top 40 charting hits over the decades they were active. There's a pretty good chance you at least know a bunch of songs of theirs, such as Nights in White Satin or The Voice or whatever. But there's also a pretty high likelihood many people coming across this video will not have ever heard a single Moody Blues album in full before. Especially if you come from my age group or younger. I feel like this is what a lot of people from my generation tend to think about the band.
The Moody Blues.
Oh, that's whatever.
It's more moody and bluesy than soft.
I would have never gotten there.
Yeah, these guys have very much been relegated to being a relic of the boomer era and are just not talked about nearly as often as a lot of their colleagues on that scene. And as you can tell from the fact that this video exists at all, I think they deserve to be better remembered. They were kind of early pioneers of the whole prog rock scene before that genre really started to take form later in the early 70s. Their second album, Days of Future Past, is often considered to be the first prog rock album ever, depending on who you ask. Though they're not the proggiest of prog rock bands either. I tend to view them as a lot closer to 60s psych rock or Beatles-adjacent psych pop than proper 70s prog like Yes. And it's worth noting they definitely have a reputation for sitting more on that soft rock and pop rock side of things on average, with a lot of sappy romantic ballads. Aside from their drummer's surname, they don't quite have the same edge to them that a band like Pink Floyd do, and don't really show much virtuoso musicianship like a lot of their later colleagues in the prog world did. Though, first of all, a lot of those sappy romantic ballads are still very well written and entirely hold up for what they are. They saw a lot of success off their ballads because they were really freaking good at those. And make no mistake, they absolutely have the ability to rock as well. Even though I liked Nights in White Satin when I first heard it in high school, it was their track I'm Just a Singer in a Rock and Roll Band which convinced me to become the much more in-depth fan that I am. That track goes mind-blowingly hard and is a must-listen if you ever had your doubts about how seriously they ought to be taken. That's probably the hardest any track of theirs goes, but it's definitely not a one-off in their catalog either. When it comes to the run of their Sacred 7 albums, as they're sometimes called, they had from the late 60s to the early 70s, you'll get no shortage of absolutely brilliant material in this vein that really takes you on all sorts of strange journeys and has fueled most of my enthusiasm for that whole 60s psych rock sound. And that's not even to get into the whole second half of their career, where they abandoned prog and psych rock altogether and turned into more of a synth pop band throughout the 80s, which went over more successfully than you'd expect, even if it got diminishing returns. Minor spoilers, much like Yes, they do have some properly really bad albums, especially near the end of their tenure, that will not be worth your time to check out. But unlike Yes, who continue to soldier on, putting out new collections of disappointing mediocrity up through present day against all better judgment or good taste or even the wishes of the fans, the Moody Blues quit while they were ahead. Or maybe more accurately, they quit after it was abundantly clear none of them had any creative steam for it anymore. After their hits dried up at the end of the 80s and early 90s, they put out one final original studio album in 1999, Strange Times, as well as a Christmas album in 2003 called December, and that was it, no more new records. They stuck to touring from then on until officially calling it quits in 2018, followed by all those band members passing away in the time since. So yeah, even with all their ups and downs, I hope this video will be able to demonstrate to newcomers or other people from my generation or younger why the Moody Blues are a band that are still absolutely worth getting into even up through present day. And I'm going really in-depth to do so. I think even more in-depth than I did for my videos on Yes or Pink Floyd. This almost borders on a full discography review compressed into one video. Disclaimers as per usual that this ranking is entirely based on my own personal opinion, and you can feel free to disagree with it. As someone who was born in the mid-90s, well after this band was over the hill, my perspective probably isn't going to line up 100% with the people who actually grew up with the band or were able to see them release albums in their heyday. If you're one of those people who believe only people who experienced the music when it first released are qualified to talk about it or allowed to enjoy it, then feel free to shut off your newfangled phone thing and go back to listening to the radio or television or whatever it is you old people do. Though at the same time, with one possible exception, I seriously doubt any of the opinions expressed in this video are actually going to be all that controversial. I think most of my feelings on this band's catalog line up with the general critical consensus on them. At the end of the day, I just wanted to make this video because I personally love this band's music and I don't see them talked about often enough. Oh, and this ranking is only going to go through their 15 main studio albums. I will not be discussing any live albums or singles compilations or anything like that, and I will also not be including their above-mentioned Christmas album from 2003 in the ranking. For what it's worth, that album is perfectly fine and respectable for what it is if you were interested in hearing it. I think most of it is original songs too, but it is still a Christmas album, and to quote Dan Olsen,
I'm gonna be honest, I hate this entire genre. I am the last person to give it a fair shake, so I'm just gonna move on.
So there we go. I think that'll be enough prelude, so let's not waste any more time and just get into it. This is the Moody Blues, worst to best. At number 15, I have Keys of the Kingdom. So, writing the script for this video has been kind of odd since I primarily listened to these albums in chronological order and wrote those segments as I went along, which meant there was a lot of writing backwards for this video. There's kind of a trend of the earlier albums being at the top with the later albums being at the bottom, and this era with Patrick Moraz on board in particular getting worse and worse with each progressive album, with this final album to involve him in 1991 being the band's absolute nadir. Though to be clear, that has little to do with Moraz himself. In fact, his involvement here is minimal at best. During the album's development, the band actually fired him for reasons I'm not entirely clear on. Either him spending too much time on other projects and or just bad vibes from his feeling the band had gotten creatively stagnant or something. And the rest of the band went on to distance themselves from him, saying things like, oh, he was only a session musician and never a real member of the band, resulting in him suing the band for wrongful dismissal because of course he was a full-time member, you can't just do that. It may have been true that Moraz was never nearly as integral a part of the band as the previous Moody's keyboardist Mike Pinder had been, but not only was he in fact an important part of how the Moody's got that commercial second win in the 80s and deserved to be called an official member just as he'd literally been advertised to be for years. I mean, he was also right on the money about the band creatively stagnating. I mean, all this behind-the-scenes drama probably didn't help matters, but yeah, creatively stagnant is a good way to describe Keys of the Kingdom. This is very much an album that sounds like nobody wanted to work on it and everybody was exhausted, pissed off, and out of ideas. The songwriting is dead simple and basic, as it had been for other albums leading up to it, but nobody's even having fun with it. The production, while I suppose not technically the worst they'd ever done, see the album I have ranked right above this one, is still super dated and bland and generic and flavorless corporate 80s slop. Just trying the exact same playbook that got them hits in the 80s again, except it's not the 80s anymore, so nobody cares about stuff that sounds like this anymore, and fittingly enough, they didn't get any charting hits out of it, aside from, I guess, the lead single, Say It With Love, peaking at number 36 in Canada. And yeah, this was very much an album that deserved to tank as hard as it did. There's not a single good or even halfway decent track on this thing. Every song is mediocre or bad. The singles at least seem to have their fans, but I don't even like any of those either. Say It With Love is such a meaningless ass sentiment, and the say part in the chorus in particular makes the whole thing feel even more disingenuous or even condescending. And the other single, Bless the Wings That Bring You Back, is just a by-the-numbers 80s power ballad that literally anyone from that era could have made. A hair metal band, a corporate rock band, a synth pop band, an R&B singer, a traditional pop singer, a large group of artists coming together for a charity single, you name it. There's absolutely nothing to this track to distinguish it from any other late 80s ballad in existence. I guess in terms of other moments that might be of interest to mention, Say What You Mean is a two-parter track that looks like it could be fun on paper, but it's just a regular old 80s pop tune that has a reprise of itself tacked on at the end, with Justin Hayward trying to do a spoken word thing for 5 seconds before realizing there was a reason Mike Pinder and Graham Edge handled the spoken word stuff before. Once Is Enough has a line in there where they name drop Days of Future Past as a cheap way to bring up, hey, remember the days when this band made music people liked? There is one single track contributed by Ray Thomas called Celtic Sonant, which feels like him trying a new age meditation thing or something. There's a track called Magic that has some really farty ass horn sections. And of course we can't forget the couple of tracks which are like a crossover between some kind of limp white guy reggae style and plagiarism. Is This Heaven unintentionally borrows heavily from the melody of the Beach Boys' Don't Worry Baby in a way that all critics, including myself, were giving them the side eye like, are you fucking serious? And Lean On Me Tonight does the same thing for the Beatles' Don't Pass Me By. Already not exactly the most well-liked of Beatles tracks, but even as someone who thinks that track gets too much undeserved hate, the Moody's take on it is nowhere near as good. Way more lifeless and bland and inessential. It takes some next-level half-assing to make Ringo Starr look more creatively ambitious than you. At least the Beatles and Beach Boys were nice enough not to also sue them over it. I guess the Moody's had enough of that going on as is. But yeah, that's about everything there is to note about Keys of the Kingdom. It sucks, and it doesn't even suck in an interesting way. There's just no reason ever to listen to this. Fucking Yes's Union gave me more to enjoy than this album does. The nicest thing I can say about it is that it's totally inoffensive, competently produced and performed to the point where my day would not be ruined if I heard any of this stuff through, like, the radio at a grocery store or something. It was an album that very much proved that the Moody Blues no longer had any commercial relevance in the mainstream, that continuing to play to the mainstream was no longer worth the effort for them, and rightly convinced the band to hang it up altogether for a long time and resign to their status as a legacy act going forward. It's a career-killing train record, except it's not interesting enough to qualify as much of a train wreck. It's just limp and underwhelming and sucks. I know this album does actually have its fans, and hey, if you do mess with this album, that's great. Glad you could get something meaningful out of it that I couldn't. But I'm not gonna pretend like I know what those people really see in it. If you asked me, I'd say you're better off skipping this one and moving on. Whoopsh. At number 14, I have Sur la Mer. Well, I guess one good song is better than zero. And okay, let's be fair, that one song is actually worth going out of your way to hear. As literally any critic who's heard this album or any greatest hit CDs or singles chart will be able to tell you, the standout in question is of course the album's opener and lead single, I Know You're Out There Somewhere. For context, on their previous album, The Other Side of Life, they'd gotten an unexpected top 10 hit in the US called Your Wildest Dreams. So in response to the amount of success that particular track had gotten, they decided to make a track as a direct sequel to it, following a number of similar chord progressions and sound palettes, becoming their final track to become a hit and chart on Billboard at all. And despite the ostensibly cynical-looking move of immediately rehashing a big hit they just got 2 years prior, I Know You're Out There Somewhere isn't just an improvement upon Your Wildest Dreams, I think it's one of the best tracks they put out in the 80s full stop. up there with The Voice and Gemini Dream. Your Wildest Dreams was a lot more like a fluffy cotton candy pop song that Justin Hayward admitted to having written almost as something of a throwaway without expecting it to see the level of success that it did. But I Know You're Out There Somewhere was written specifically keeping in mind that the feeling behind it was something that struck a chord with so many people, and thus does a lot more to actively highlight the emotional weight behind it. Make it feel a lot more dramatic and tragic, and Hayward giving his performance a lot more of a sense of desperation he didn't have on the track's predecessor. Actually, genuinely great track that reminds me that the style of pop rock that was most popular in the late 80s is still capable of delivering some gems worth going out of your way to hear. However, again, I recommend hearing only that one track and literally nothing else here, because the rest of this album is shit like this. This album is a prime example of everything I hate about 80s production. Just this super sterile, flavorless, and ridiculously overproduced blend of corporate pop rock. All the biggest cliches of the time, from the interchangeable of-the-time guitar soloing to the Jammin' Lewis-style keyboard riffs and plastic sax solos on tracks like River of Endless Love, to even copy-pasting the goddamn Phil Collins In the Air Tonight drum break on 2 different songs. It's there on both No More Lies and Breaking Point. That actually had me bursting out laughing when it happened. The songwriting is super basic and rudimentary too, full of shallow cliches about peace and love that don't really mean anything. At this point, Justin Hayward and John Lodge had taken over 100% of the songwriting duties, as they were the ones most likely to write the hits. And so the other members who might otherwise provide their own different angles, which were crucial in their own right to getting the Moody's sound as interesting as it was, got shafted here. Ray Thomas doesn't even perform a single instrument on this thing, let alone write a song or contribute vocals or anything. And the clear focus on writing hits above all else means Hayward and Lodge took the opportunity to try to sound as contemporary as possible without any of the flares that might actually be recognizable as the Moody blues. The ballad tracks like Wanna Be With You or No More Lies or Love Is On the Run, while listenable, show all the band's personality surgically removed to the point where they just sound like royalty-free music to use in the background of commercials. I feel like even their typically great vocal harmonies got bizarrely screechier and more obnoxious on the former of those cuts, and somehow I think that was the second best track here. There's also the more cheerful Vintage Wine, which has the most basic-ass scale exercise-type chorus melodies that a kid could come up with. But the tracks on this thing attempting to be harder rockers end up becoming the most offensive dog shit I've ever heard out of this band. Here Comes the Weekend might very well be the worst track this band has ever made. The synths are so garish and obnoxious and sound like farting, complete with completely fake horn sections, and the lyrics about partying on the weekend are so brainless to the point of being insulting. Coming from this band in particular, it feels so fucking forced and insincere and like mindlessly running through a record executive's checklist of what the kids are into these days. But there's also some proper competition for worst spot on the album. There's also Miracle, which has to be a gallery of all the absolute worst production choices the album has to offer, just to the absolute shittiest sounding guitars and MIDI horn sections that can make me physically recoil in pain. And of course we can't forget the closer Deep, which shows Hayward trying to write a goddamn sex jam, complete with Seinfeld-type slap bass lines and very quiet synthetic breathing and moaning noises in the background. Why the fuck? Just, why the fuck? The presence of I Know You're Out There Somewhere on this album is able to single-handedly save it from not falling in dead last in this ranking. And I guess unlike Keys of the Kingdom, where everyone sounds fucking burnt out and out of ideas and like nobody wants to be there, at the very least it sounds like Hayward and Lodge were probably having some fun making this one, reveling in all the money and success they were seeing in that special 80s boomer way. Not to mention, Hayward and Lodge, or at least Hayward, is an earnest enough singer to make his tracks feel somewhat sincere and make some of this corporate-esque garbage feel a bit more palatable. And if this means anything to you, I bet you anything that this album is probably one of Patrick Bateman's favorite albums of all time. Like, it's perfectly fine-tuned to the main character of American Psycho's yuppie pop taste, with all his love of Huey Lewis and the News. Could easily imagine him getting turned as fuck to this shit while talking to his co-worker about how the band found new commercial and artistic heights on the other side of life, and how this album is their undisputed masterpiece, unfairly dismissed because of its lack of resemblance to the band's past reputation as pretentious art rockers. An all-time classic hit like I Know You're Out There Somewhere is so catchy that most people won't hear the rest of this album and discover the deeper messages about the universal importance of getting away for good times in the summer, as well as the simple joy of materialistic pleasures. Hey, Paul! But yeah, unless that's also your taste, these are some low-ass bars to clear. In my mind, the album isn't unfairly dismissed at all, it's dismissed for very good reason, and a couple of these lowest points might be even lower than the worst parts of Keys of the Kingdom. Keep the one great track and trash the rest. At number 13, I have the magnificent Moody's. Oh yeah, their first album way back from 1965, chronicling the days of Denny Laine being the frontman of the band. I mean, it's better than the shitty generic corporate rock they were doing at the end of the 80s, but I still don't really care for this album too much. See, even if they have 3 members in common, the Moody Blues pre-Days of Future Past is such a completely different beast from any later incarnation of the band. It's barely even recognizable as the same band at all, aside from maybe a few of the vocal harmonies in the background of a few tracks. These aren't the psych rock pioneers or even the pop-friendly balladeers you know. This incarnation of the band is a one-hit wonder British invasion act who were most preoccupied with covering R&B and soul and blues tracks, really showing where the blues part of the Moody Blues comes from. If you know literally anything from this era of the Moody Blues, it'll be Go Now, their cover of a song originally performed by Bessie Banks. The original wasn't a hit at all and remains near completely unknown to this day, but the Moody Blues version went all the way to number 1 in the UK and number 10 over here in the US. Ouch. And it was big enough to the point where when this album hit shelves in the US, the album was given a slightly different track listing and retitled to Go Now, the Moody Blues number 1. Also ouch for everyone involved. Go Now is a fine song. It's got some nice 60s harmonies and they put the right amount of emotion into it. I don't enjoy it on even close to the same level as the stuff they do later. It ain't an all-time classic, but it's perfectly fine. Denny Laine is fine as a frontman for the band and has that right British invasion voice to sell these. His falsetto may be nails on a chalkboard as seen on other tracks like Thank You Baby and especially Bye Bye Bird. But when he sticks to his mid-range, like on the big hit, he's likable enough. He sounds like a more nasal and limited-range version of Paul McCartney or George Harrison. I bet it'd be cool if Laine would go on to work with Paul McCartney in a band or something. Maybe one that would end up on the run, as it were. Well, that would probably never happen. In terms of other tracks here, they did 2 surprisingly respectable covers of James Brown songs in I'll Go Crazy and I Don't Mind. And the track Something You Got is nice too. I like the flute on that one. Although there's more covers here of songs so obviously not written for white people to be singing that it comes off kind of cringeworthy to be hearing the Moody's taking their stabs on them at all. See them trying to sound like Motown artists on Can't Nobody Love You and I've Got a Dream, or covering It Ain't Necessarily So from Porgy and Bess. There are also a number of original tracks written by Denny Laine and Mike Pinder all gathered together on the second side. Although these have the other downside of being completely forgettable, the second side of this album is markedly weaker than the first side. Most versions on this album currently on streaming also come with a load of B-sides and other tracks from the same era, including the tracks that only appeared on the US version, some of which even sound better than the stuff that made the main album in the UK, despite the way worse title that US version might actually be the superior version. But yeah, while the Magnificent Moody's is listenable enough for what it is and will do you well if you're in the mood for something that just sounds like just the most of a product of 1965 as you'll ever hear, I wouldn't say it's really worth going out of your way for unless you're really curious to see where they started, and even in its best moments it's still pretty middle of the road for this era. I don't think this sound fits them nearly as well as what they'd go on to do. They can sometimes feel very out of their element. And that sour note of a band later known for some of the whitest and most stereotypically British music ever, trying to come up within these genres much more closely associated with black culture in the southern US, can't really be ignored. I mean, I suppose I could say that listening to this album is kind of like listening to one of those early half-cover Beatles albums, like Beatles for Sale or With the Beatles, featuring all the takes on the catalog of Chuck Berry and Little Richard and all those. Albeit this album, for lack of a better description, is a moodier listen that focuses more on blues. There's definitely a similar experience to be gleaned out of this stuff, but on the other hand, the Beatles' early period covers don't feel nearly as weird for me to listen back to for many different reasons. A, covers were never the Beatles' main selling points in comparison with the stuff they wrote themselves, while this album is being sold specifically on the merit of the covers. B, I personally grew up hearing plenty of Chuck Berry and Little Richard and already understood them to be legends who were much more important to the formation of rock and roll when I was a little kid, thus I wasn't under any misapprehension about what the Beatles' covers were. Meanwhile, neither I nor my dad even realized Go Now was a cover at all until I found out while researching this video, which felt more wrong to me in the moment. And of course, C, I mean, we're making a comparison to the fucking Beatles? Arguably the most universally well-acclaimed musical act of the entire last century, whose music has been so stiffly ingrained in my life since my literal birth. Not that there's any crime in not being the Beatles, but I think it goes without saying that those guys were much better performers than the Moodies back then, and they had much more the ability to sell their covers well without letting the music lose its edge in the process. I don't know, not to make all of this out to be a bigger deal than it really is. It's obviously not like this is the stuff that the Moody Blues are actually remembered for today, or even that they saw much financial success off of this stuff at the time, outside of the one song which only got them so far and even apparently initially saw most of the money conned out of them by their manager at the time. This is not an Elvis-level cultural injustice or anything, and depending on who you ask, the fact that they saw so much less success on the back of this stuff might even make it more excusable than what the Beatles did, but at the end of the day, this era of the band just never did anything for me. Hearing this stuff just always left a weird taste in my mouth, and little to none of the appeal that actually made me a fan of the band to begin with shows through on this thing. Again, a bit of a weird, slightly uncomfortable taste is still preferable to the active distaste I had for Keys of the Kingdom and Sur la Mer. This album feels a lot less like an obvious cynical cash grab than those, and I'm inclined to be nicer to it as a result. But the results still feel mediocre to me at best, just as I'd pretty much never actively choose to hear With the Beatles over Sgt. Pepper or Magical Mystery Tour or all those. The Magnificent Moodies is an album that I'm unlikely to keep around or come back to again, and I think it's mostly been forgotten for good reason. Whoopsh. At number 12, I have Octave. And while we're on the topic of mediocre albums which have unique reasons for being mediocre, this album came out in 1978, back when Mike Pinder was still technically part of the band. They'd come off the heels of a fairly long period of having been broken up altogether, with various attempts at solo records that I haven't been interested enough to hear in the interim. Eventually, 6 years had passed since their previous album, Seventh Sojourn, had come out, so they decided, hey, how about we get the band back together and make a comeback record? Unfortunately for them, a lot changes over the course of 6 years, and unless your name was Pink Floyd, the late 70s were not nearly as kind to those old psych and prog acts as the early 70s were. Nobody was really clamoring for the same late 60s sound the Moodies used to deliver back in their prime by the time 1978 rolled around, let alone the band members themselves, as far as I can tell from what very limited bits I've heard of their solo work. And as such, they had to walk that tightrope of having to both somewhat modernize their sound in order to maintain the commercial appeal they might have had before, while also delivering the style that their core fanbase might actually expect from them. And at least commercially, the result was a decent success. Got them a couple of singles charting on the Hot 100 too. But critically, the reviews were a lot more mixed than anything they'd done previously, and on top of that, there was also some drama going on behind the scenes too. Mike Pinder left the band partway through the album's recording, having just started a family and wanting to focus on that instead, never to return to the band again. And the same deal goes with the band's longtime producer Tony Clark, who would also leave thanks to a family-related disaster and never come back to work with the band again. There's just bad vibes going around this album's backstory, and that's before you get to the album itself, which, well, it's not terrible by any stretch. It's all perfectly listenable enough and well performed and stuff. It sounds like the Moody Blues. But it's the Moody Blues in an awkward transitional period. They're clearly evolving away from the sound they pioneered in the late 60s and early 70s, and there's a lot more synths and even a few horns and saxophones in the mix to make it fit more in line with what was trendy for 1978. But at the same time, they haven't actually moved into the synth pop style that would characterize their work after this point. Most of the music on this album kind of sticks to the same style of dreamy soft rock ballads that could frequently be heard on their previous album, Seventh Sojourn. And also, not unlike a decent chunk of the material on that album, the vast majority of this project is taken up by ballads that just kind of meander without really having a hook. Under Moonshine, Driftwood, Had to Fall in Love, Survival, I'm Your Man, The Day We Meet Again. So many forgettable tunes that are nothing but soft rock background music for me. Okay, none of these tracks are bad either. They all have halfway decent tunes that even could have theoretically worked had they been produced back in their classic period. But even at their best, they can't compete with any of the stuff they'd been doing in said period. Mike Pinder's only songwriting contribution, One Step Into the Light, was apparently even an old track from years prior that they'd never released. It does work as a fond goodbye to his tenure in the band, although his name-dropping the Mellotron was a little on the nose. Not to mention ironic for an album that features no Mellotrons at all. And that's not even to get into how several of these tracks just sound like worse versions of old classic period tracks of theirs. Under Moonshine is a worse version of Our Guessing Game. Had to Fall in Love is a worse version of Emily's Song. I'll Be Level With You is boneless After You Came. You may as well just go back to Every Good Boy Deserves Favor instead at that point. And again, not to bash on the songwriting too much, again, it's okay. The classic albums did set the bar very high. Not being as good as Every Good Boy Deserves Favor is not a crime. But I think the real most glaring issue on this project that makes it particularly hard to recommend is the production. I already mentioned how this album incorporated a lot more synths and organs and the uses of stuff like saxophones, which didn't really feel like an effective fit for their classic era songwriting, but just the way these mixes come together feels off. Like how the sax solo on Driftwood is hard pan to the left, or how some of the guitar solos sound like they were recorded in a different studio to the rest of the band. Or especially how Graham Edge's drumming always feels so quiet and muffled and lacking in impact across the board. All these production choices can make several of these tracks sound more like stock royalty-free music beds again. Now, in this album's defense, there are a couple of moments on this project that don't sound like they're trying to recapture and modernize the appeal of classic Moody's, and end up with something different altogether that, in my opinion, go over better than anything else on the project. The biggest highlight on this thing is the album's opener, lead single, and biggest hit, Steppin' in a Slide Zone. This is such a weird track for the Moody's that doesn't sound quite like anything else they ever did before or afterwards. I guess it's a proto-synth pop track that sort of informs the direction they'd go in later, but it's also trying to be big and rollicking and epic and bring in some rock swagger to it with all these half-shouted choruses. Very odd, but intriguingly so. They'd refine the synth pop sound into something that felt much more natural to them later, but this early attempt at the style has its own interesting flavor to it, which I do like, and they have a solid hook to back themselves up. The other odd standout track on this thing for me is Top Rank Suite. This is an especially controversial one with the fans, since it's the closest the band ever got to trying to get funky and bring in the full-on horn sections in the most obvious way. On paper, that sounds mildly horrifying, but in execution it sounds more like the kind of jazzy interlude music that gets played on Saturday Night Live or something, and even if I may be alone on this take, I think it works more effectively than it has any right to. I totally get why people hate it, but I think it's a fun time, and again stuck out in my mind as this bizarre one-off anomaly in their catalog that nothing even remotely similar to it happened again. But still, that's 2 more interesting tracks out of 10, not exactly representative of the experience the full album gives you. This isn't an album that's going to ruin your life if you hear it, it's not a difficult listen to get through, and its status as this transitional moment for the band trying to find their footing in a new era where they didn't really fit does technically make it more interesting than the stuff they were doing at the end of the 80s. It sounds more like the Moody Blues than any of the albums I have ranked below this. But on the whole, it's just more underwhelming than anything, and you wouldn't be missing anything absolutely essential if you skipped it. Whoopsh. At number 11, I have The Other Side of Life.
Baby, 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 let's investigate.
Right now, this is a weird one to quantify. This is the 3rd album in the Patrick Moraz era, and the only album to feature any writing credits from Moraz himself. He co-wrote the track The Spirit with Graham Edge. Although that's not really as notable a point as you'd think. There's nothing really interesting to note about that track outside of that fact. This album was, however, another notable turning point for the band. While they'd been slowly transitioning in the direction of synth pop for their previous 3 albums, this might be the first one to lean entirely into synth pop without any hints of the band's previous identity as a psych rock band. The songs were markedly more straightforward and simplistic than the already progressively more straightforward and simplistic material they were delivering on the albums leading up to this. The songwriting is a lot shallower and the songs come off a lot goofier. But there was also a noticeable drop in production quality from their previous albums going into this one. They started to use computers a lot more behind the scenes, and it's really noticeable in terms of the stock MIDI bass lines, among other stock MIDI sounds that show up on several tracks, including the album's big hit, Your Wildest Dreams. The sound of this whole project is super dated to this one specific time in the mid-80s and more overtly cheesy than anything they'd released up to this point. By the way, I haven't mentioned this yet, but this album, Sur la Mer and Keys of the Kingdom were all produced or co-produced by the same guy, and you want to know who that was? Tony Visconti, the same guy who produced David Bowie's Berlin trilogy. Yeah, I wish I was joking. I can't imagine anyone would be able to guess that was the case purely by listening to this stuff. Bowie may have made the right call ditching him for the Let's Dance era. Now, from all of that, it probably sounds like I think this album is crap as well, outside of Your Wildest Dreams, but weirdly enough, I think it ended up growing on me the more time I spent with it. On first return listen, this thing sucked, but I ended up warming up to all of it over time. First of all, as dated as this album sounds, I will say at least it doesn't feel either as generic or as distasteful as the two albums that would follow it. The synth pop sound and occasional cheap MIDI instrumentation at least adds up to a flavor that might still be able to work well enough for people with more actual 80s nostalgia. It feels like they're playing guitar and singing over the soundtrack to a Nintendo 64 or Sega Genesis game sometimes. And honestly, I did find that a little charming in its own perverse guilty pleasure sort of way. On top of that, what with how simplistic the songwriting started to get by this point, this became an album that entirely lives and dies on the strength of its hooks. And the hooks on this one are admittedly all pretty solid. Your Wildest Dreams is the catchiest, big surprise there. Still a little weird to me that that track is their second highest charting single in the US ever, behind only Nights in White Satin. I guess the Billboard Hot 100 do be like that sometimes. But that track's not the catchiest by nearly as big a margin as I would have expected. Other tracks like Talkin', Rock and Roll Over You, I Just Don't Care, It May Be a Fire, pretty much all of them have a catchy and well-constructed enough tune to still be passable at the very worst. There's barely anything to note about these tracks outside of their hooks. I think the only track here to have any kind of more interesting instrumental flair was the title track, which had a little bit of that bluesier flavor to its composition, and a whole bunch of neat keyboard soloing going over its lengthier near 7-minute running time. That was cool. Even if Baby, 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 Let's Investigate felt like an awkward choice of words for the hook. Outside of that, most of these tracks just have their one hook and stick to it and there won't be anything else to say. Sometimes the brainlessness of the songwriting and or the cheesiness of the production can make a few of these tracks start to flirt with annoying territory, especially when they try to bring back some of their roots in old school rock and roll in the chord progressions. And it can come off pretty corny. See Slings and Arrows for the single goofiest example by far, or certain parts of Running Out of Love to a lesser extent. But honestly, even those kind of grew on me over time too. The tunes all over this album are likable enough to at least raise the stuff to the level of decent. Even if they seemingly made cuts in all the other departments, it's clear they were focused on getting those melodies to work above literally anything else, and at least in that one department, it is a success. I cannot bring myself to say this album is essential listening by any stretch. It really doesn't play to the Moody's usual strengths, and I'm probably not going to keep it around after I put this video up, but I can at least see something like this possibly having an audience who might be able to get into it more than me, and I suppose it could also be worth hearing to provide further context for why I Know You're Out There Somewhere struck as much of a chord with me as it did if you want. It's not bad, I did get enjoyment out of it, but it was a shallow kind of enjoyment. And I do feel like if you decided to skip it, you probably wouldn't be missing out on anything life-changing. Whoopsh. And number 10, I have Strange Times. And while we're on the topic of particularly weird projects to quantify, here's their final album of all original studio material from 1999. After Keys of the Kingdom flopped, they took a nice long hiatus for new material before making this one last comeback attempt here at the end of the decade. And after this album ended up not really moving the needle for the state of the band, they hung it up on writing new music. Ray Thomas quit the band shortly after. The Christmas album happened as a mostly inessential epilogue to their story, and that was it for them, leaving this album spiritually carrying the mantle as the band's final send-off a la The Division Bell. And, well, it's still not exactly great. It's a massive mixed bag at best, and also has the unique issue of coming from the CD era and thereby having noticeably more filler and less structure than most Moody's albums. But given how low the band had fallen for that run of albums leading up to the end of the Patrick Moraz era, this still reads as a reasonably respectable return to form. It's still just 14 tracks at just under an hour, so, like, that's reasonable lengthwise. Far from the worst example of overstuffing a CD in the 90s. And there are a solid handful of actual good songs here, and not just one that kinda hit me on a shallow guilty pleasure level like the entirety of The Other Side of Life did. In fact, there's even one properly great track here, and if you guessed that would be the opener and lead single English Sunset, yeah, of course it is. The completely different approach to the synths on this project, care of new session keyboardist and orchestral arranger Danilo Madonia, are showcased in the best way here. A lot more of a liquidy 90s texture to them, perhaps taking very mild influences from the techno scene that had been going on for a while now. Automatically, that's going to appeal to me more than any standard 80s production. But the way they're worked into this really breezy and fast-paced tune with easily their strongest hook, since I Know You're Out There Somewhere, ends up with such a nice and uplifting mix, evoking a very genuine feeling sense of joy, which Hayward sells really well, is the kind of track that can evoke good times by the seaside without feeling like some kind of condescending watering down of their formula as most of Sur La Mer did. It's just really freaking nice and super easy to like in a way that isn't quite comparable to any other track in their catalog. It's such a good track, I'm almost kind of surprised it didn't become a hit even this far out of their prime in 1999. Although I guess it was too much about being proud to be English to be hitting in the US. And while that is the best cut here by a pretty significant distance, I'm happy to report it's not the only track here worth going out of your way for. There were two other tracks from this album that I bumped just as regularly when I was younger, being the title track and The One. Both just really well-assembled pop rock songs with really strong and memorable tunes and some solid energy behind them. The title track from this album is so catchy it pops into my head anytime I see anyone talking about living in strange times. Maybe a little wild to think about 1999 of all times is strange when we're in 2024, but it's too catchy for me to care much. And The One is probably the second biggest rocker on the album, a lot of cool harmonizing and melodic interplay going on there. I saw the theory that the lyrics on that one might be a dig at a past band member, but ironically with all the lines about selling out, the price of fame, and becoming irrelevant, that feels more like self-critique. Like Hayward and Lodge were writing from the perspective of their fans who were frustrated by their entire career arc through the end of the 80s, but were still hanging on to hope that they might turn things back around. I suppose it being about the Patrick Moraz drama is also possible, but that would mean that they're saying a band member they fired sold his soul by suing them for wrongful dismissal only to become irrelevant, which would be so fucking shitty. I'm choosing not to go with that interpretation as I'd prefer to continue enjoying the track. I think my reading makes a little more sense as well, honestly. Speaking of other non-Hayward and Lodge band members, though, while their contributions are minor at best, they still leave a clear impression. Ray Thomas has a cute little fairy tale themed acoustic ditty called My Little Lovely. Far too short at less than 2 minutes, but still enough to remind me of why his writing style was an important addition to the classic era Moody's projects and thereby mark it as a highlight. And Graham Edge is tasked with closing out the album and delivering one of his usual spoken word poems over a synth-backed instrumental for the closer Nothing Changes, reading it out himself with no Mike Pinder to do it for him this time, but honestly you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. It's a track about Y2K, like how there have been all these prophecies of doom and the end of the world, but we're all still here and going to keep on living anyway. Another track that's weird to look back on in 2024 when it feels like we've gotten so much closer to the world ending that could ever be envisioned in 1999. But I still like it as this reminder to maintain optimism. Humanity has survived lots of crazy catastrophes and wars and whatnot in the past, but we continue to keep on living. As the final note to end their final album of all original studio material, I think that's a really nice sentiment to close out with, and feels like it's bringing things around full circle to Days of Future Past as well. I also really like the track The Swallow that comes right before it. Another nice little heartwarming tune to that one from Hayward with lots of warm acoustic guitar noodling. Now, as many solid tracks I've mentioned on this thing, there are admittedly just as many duds in the track listing as well. Mostly just bland ballads attempting to play to the adult contemporary crowd of the time that just don't leave any impression. John Lodge contributes a whole bunch of these, not just forgettable filler like Whatever You Say, but also some much more dramatic slow burn cuts that attempt to bring back the symphonic side of the Moody sound. Most notably on Words You Say and Forever Now, which bring back the full orchestra and everything. And God bless him, he is really trying to sell these as hard as he can, but he just did not have the vocal range to pull it off anymore. He's really straining to hit some of those higher notes, and it's rough. Also, the tune on Words You Say is clearly just a weaker copy of Isn't Life Strange. The orchestras work a little better on Love Don't Come Easy. I do like the way the chorus sounds on that one, but the rest is meh. Justin Hayward's contributions have tended to fare better. He did write the Easy Best track on the album, but he's got some real clunkers too. In fact, he also wrote the Easy Worst track on the album, All That Is Real Is You. That one is a total snooze fest and like a non-effort coming from him. Foolish Love is also just a bit more energy at least, but a weak tune. There's also 2 tracks near the beginning that have really strong hooks to almost make for potential highlights, but didn't quite stick the landing. Haunted has all these cheery do-do-do-do-do vocals running through the whole thing to make it a little cheesy and unfitting for the title. And sooner or later, Walkin' on Air just has way too bland and basic instrumental arrangements, and there's this constant feeling I get out of hearing that track and the way the melody is constructed that there should be some of the Moody's trademark vocal harmonizing when there isn't any. It's kind of odd. But if you take all of that, that basically makes this half a really good album and half an okay album. 6 highlights, 6 fillery skips, and those latter 2 I mentioned, which are like halfway in between. For a Moody Blues album in 1999, that's a pretty decent track record. Again, I can't in good faith say this album is absolutely essential listening, but there is a surprising amount of material here that does still work. Certainly much more than on the run of 3 previous albums they'd released. Capturing both what worked about their 80s material as well as what worked about their classic 60s and 70s material too, while also getting it to sound contemporary and not behind the times in a way that wasn't embarrassing. And for a bunch of guys who were all in their late 50s at the time of recording, I can respect how much they actually did manage to stick the landing on. It's not their best by any stretch, more for the already converted fans and not recommended for anyone looking for a good starting point, but there is at least some stuff actively worth hearing here and that I've held close to me for a long time now. And of course I have extra respect for the Moody's for having the good taste to not go the Tangerine Dream route of endlessly continuing to crank out content, instead giving their tenures this clear stopping point. Even ending on a decently dignified comparative high note rather than a half-assed disappointment like Keys of the Kingdom. It's not bad at all, maybe even worth a browse through. And number 9, I have The Present.
Heart and soul took control.
Now this one's kinda interesting. This is their second album in the Patrick Moraz era, coming off the heels of one of their most successful projects in years in Long Distance Voyager. And on paper, it seems like they were just aiming to recapture the success of that album again, even structuring it the exact same way as that project. Though in execution, they ended up with something a little different. A fair bit more stripped back and mid-tempo and just kinda slightly strange in a way that's difficult to put a finger on. In one breath, this project is also something of a mixed bag, though it's the lowest album in this ranking to have more tracks I actively enjoy than I either dislike or am just ambivalent to. In terms of those lower points, Going Nowhere is a bit of an aimless ballad that lives up to its title, even if Ray Thomas's performance is pretty solid, and it did eventually grow on me a bit after I came back to it after having written the lower ranked segments. Running Water seems to be generally remembered well, and it was even released as the album's 3rd single in the US only. The tune vaguely reminds me of one of their classic period tracks, Voices in the Sky, and kind of works in a similar way, although A, it's clearly not as good a tune as that track, and B, putting a track with such a cheerily wistful tone to it through this more 80s sounding production kind of waters it down, pun intended, and initially made it feel saccharine to the point of slight obnoxiousness. Although once I did get past the comparison to that old, obviously better classic period track, it became easier to stomach. That one also kind of grew on me. But easily the worst track for me has to be It's Cold Outside of Your Heart, another forgettable-ass flavorless ballad that hits in the same way as the filler on Strange Times, such as All That Is Real Is You. That one never grew on me. But honestly, if that's the worst this album has to offer, again, that's not too shabby a track record. In terms of actual highlights, obviously the big singles are among the strongest moments. Blue World may be something of a more mid-tempo repeat of their track The Voice from Long Distance Voyager, but it still has a strong enough tune to carry it. The highest charting hit from this album is Sitting at the Wheel, and it's easily the hardest rocking track on the album, though it's like a weird mix of synth-pop and rockabilly that doesn't sound like any other track they'd ever made up to that point. I guess it goes pretty hard, and I like the tune, even if it's never failed to feel a little odd that they chose to go that particular direction with it. Bit of a hint at the direction that certain parts of The Other Side of Life ended up going in, I suppose. And in between those two is a nice track called Meet Me Halfway that acts as a bridge between those tracks and gets them all to kind of flow together more. Also probably could have been a decently successful single had it been released as one. But the rest of the deep cuts take a few particularly odd turns. Odd in a good way. Like having this somewhat marching bandish instrumental interlude, Hole in the World, transitioning into this stomping tune called Under My Feet. That sticks in a couple of horn sections and xylophones in the background of certain parts that caught me off guard a bit, left me not really sure whether or not I liked it on first return listen, but again, did grow on me the more times I sat with it. It just sounds interesting. And Ray Thomas's contributions at the end of the album are even more out of the box. We've got an interlude called I Am, which is trying to be this big, epic, dramatic synth and flute buildup with lyrics about, I don't know, roses growing underwater and being the sun or something, I don't know. Transitioning directly into the closer Sorry, which trades off between being a lower key ballad and one of the album's more epic sounding rockers depending on which part of the track you're hearing. The twists and turns this track goes on almost make this ending feel marginally experimental by the loosest possible standard of 80s Moody's. Obviously not to overstate how strange the ideas going into this album really are. For the most part, the overall sound of this thing sounds pretty close to the other projects they were putting out in this era, especially the album it aimed to directly follow up. And there's no single moment here that I absolutely love. My favorite track was probably just Blue World for having the catchiest and best constructed tune, even if that's the moment that feels the most like rehashing the success of their previous album. An album like Strange Times may have a lot more filler, but I think its high points are higher. There's no track here that hits for me on the level of English Sunset or even that album's title track, if I'm being honest. However, this is definitely better than Strange Times, since it's the last Moody's album that A, still maintains some of their weirder and more artistic impulses before the commercialism completely took over, and B, works best as a complete whole being listened to from front to back instead of just a collection of songs. So I do have to give it credit for that. I won't say it's an absolute must-listen, they do obviously have plenty of more interesting albums, but it is pretty good. The first album in this ranking that I would definitively qualify as good, even if only just. Whoopsh. And number 8, I have A Question of Balance. Okay, finally, it's time to actually start talking about the Moody's classic period and the albums they put out in that run of projects from the end of the 60s through to the early 70s, sometimes referred to as the Sacred Seven. This is the stuff from the band that really connected with me on that deeper level and the main reasons for me wanting to make this video in the first place. This is the good stuff that the band is really remembered for. I mean, just look at that album cover. Already that promises more of a wild and imaginative experience than any of the pop projects I just got done talking about. And just the vibe and sound of this album is a big jump from any of the later period stuff. These somewhat airy soft rock instrumentals with mild symphonic elements floating throughout this project, but still with just enough rock to maintain some level of excitement. This is the kind of thing I specifically come to the Moody Blues for, and the style that I feel like their voices sound the most natural going over. Anyway, you know how I hinted in the intro of this video that there was one album in this ranking that I might have a controversial take on? I do like this album, but we are still on the lower end of the good spectrum. There's a lot less of a distance in quality between this and the present than you'd expect, and it's obviously my least favorite classic era Moody's record. Having come after 4 projects in a row, all of which I'll get to later, that had their densest and luscious sound palettes and grandest high concepts, an album like this that has so much more of a direct and straightforward approach in comparison and saw them writing more regular sounding rock songs in their usual style, while for many fans the results ended up all the easier to connect with and more accessible, for me, someone who prefers the band at their artsiest, I was maybe a little disappointed coming back to this one. I certainly don't blame them for going in this direction at this point in their history, as their previous material wasn't the easiest to recreate in a live setting, and the grander psychedelic sounds were getting diminishing returns in terms of their commercial success. But it was a little deflating to hear a lot of the album feeling like less interesting takes on sounds they'd done earlier, especially considering how insane and visually dense that album cover is. While I was first writing these segments, I was still expecting it to be more charitable to this album and even rank it one spot higher, though the longer I sat with it and the next album in the ranking, the more I realized I had less of an urge to sit with this one in full in the future. Again, don't get me wrong, it's still good, but it's easily the least consistent of the classic Moody's albums. These tracks are a lot more scattered and all over the place quality-wise than those you'd find on most of their albums in this era, and if not for the way the tracks literally crossfade into each other, there'd be nothing tying them together into a more cohesive whole. Even The Present feels more cohesively structured and consistent than this album does, although that album's high points can't come even close to competing with this album's high points. A Question of Balance is very much an album I like for specific moments than for the full package. Now, those specific moments in question are still absolutely fantastic to the point of making this album worth hearing on their own. The opener and almost title track Question is unquestionably my favorite here. Justin Hayward patched it together out of 2 unfinished songs, which does kind of show, with the beginning and end being so strikingly high energy and fast-paced in such an immediately attention-grabbing way, and the whole middle section being much more of a toned-down, semi-optimistic ballad, but they complement each other perfectly, and really make the song feel like it's taking you on even more of a journey. It's also probably the most political the band ever got to, expressing frustration at the hate and death and war going on around at the time and feeling lost among all the ills of the world, waiting for a miracle in their lives. Easy top 5 favorite track of theirs here. The other really big highlight for me, I think, is Melancholy Man, another track lamenting the ills and injustices of the world and very much living up to the melancholy of its title. It's one of the biggest downers in their catalog to the point of practically being a funeral dirge, but it's a surprisingly catchy funeral dirge at that. The core melodies repeating through the length of the track can easily get stuck in my head, and the way the vocal harmonies wrap around everything makes it sound really expansive and pretty, and really enhances the chilling effect they're going for. Maybe even bringing back a tiny bit of that blues influence they got their name from. I would get it if some found the track monotonous, but there's been times where I've had this track playing in my head for like a full day straight and I've still never gotten sick of it. The rest of this album misses just as often as it hits. The worst track here is probably Minstrel Song. Don't worry, they mean the medieval kind of minstrel and not the other kind. I mean, it's fine, just a cheery track about how love is all around, which kind of melodically reminds me of the old German folk songs that my grandmother used to sing to me as a toddler. But that one can get really annoying if I'm not in the right mood. Dawning is the Day has some very pretty tunes, but has the tendency to disappear from my head pretty much immediately after it's done. Don't You Feel Small could have been a fun track and even a possible highlight if not for the inclusion of Graham Edge whispering the lyrics alongside the rest of the band doing their normal harmonies. That track consistently throws me off despite having one of the stronger tunes. And speaking of Graham Edge, the closer The Balance features spoken word passages written by Edge, and okay, on one hand, the Moody Blues is one of the few bands in existence who can consistently get away with including spoken word in their music and actually get it to feel meaningful and complement the music. I typically really like their approach to spoken word, and Mike Pinder has the absolute perfect voice to deliver it. But this is the one point where even they couldn't get me to fully take them seriously. It's about this guy randomly finding an orange and eating it, and it was good. And then, like, he philosophically thinks about life before the song randomly breaks into a completely different tune about opening your eyes and realizing the way it's always been. The track is pretty clunky in its structure, and the line about the orange being good always makes me let out a chuckle at its unfittingly basic word choice. It's not a very strong finish to this album. Still, I guess if tracks like those are the worst parts, that's still a better track record than almost anything they did after 1972. All those tracks still range from decent to okay, and none of them are outright bad. And the remaining tracks I haven't yet mentioned are all much better. How Is It We Are Here is a good stomping tune about the irony of how we mine rare minerals out of the ground and ruin the environment only just to bury them again in depositories. And The Tide Rushes In is a nice low-key ballad about impermanence and Ray Thomas's conflicts with his ex-wife. The third best melody on this album probably belongs to It's Up to You, a nice and breezy and uplifting tune that just puts me in a good mood despite being about feelings of frustration in a relationship. And Tortoise in the Hare is the album's second most energetic moment and is about what its title implies. John Lodge made the comment that he intended it as sort of symbolic for how the Moody Blues sound might be slightly falling behind the times, but they're still sticking to their guns and doing what they most believe in. Considering where they ended up a decade and a half later, refreshing to hear. All around, A Question of Balance is a very enjoyable album from front to back. I'm fully expecting other people to have this one much higher up in their rankings, given it is one of their most successful and easily recognizable projects, and I still think it's worth hearing. I just don't think it really comes together as a complete whole very well, or has that much of their absolute best material, outside of obviously the opener and maybe Melancholy Man. It's a fun listen, but a bit of a mess. Whoopsh. At number 7, I have Seventh Sojourn. Oh, how about that?
I woke up today, I was crying.
Right now, this is a weird one to talk about. So, before I even get into anything else, you know that track I was talking about in the intro of this video, which first turned me into an in-depth fan of the Moodies in the first place? I'm just a singer in a rock and roll band? That's the closer of this album. I will reiterate, that track genuinely goes insanely hard in a way that not that many tracks from this band can match. Every performance, from the drums to the guitars to the pianos to the Chamberlin keyboards, fake orchestral patches to the layers of vocal harmonizing, lead to probably the single most mind-blowingly dense and propulsive track that the Moodies ever had to their name. The lyrics did briefly throw me off a little bit when I actually read through them for this video, thanks to this little part. I always thought they said lies by the people and not riots by the people, and the real wording could be interpreted like they're talking down to protesters for getting too violent, which given their statuses as successful white boomers, it's unfortunately not impossible for that to have been the intention. However, I'm choosing to believe it's just meant as, like, there's so much needless war and destruction in the world that they don't understand. And all of that is secondary to the more obvious main point of the song, which is to highlight that they are not your saviors. As much as their vocal deliveries consistently seem to evoke deep wisdom about the answers to the universe over all their other classics, they don't really have the answers to the universe or the solutions to all the strife going on in the world. They're just a rock and roll band. Don't put them on a pedestal or expect famous people like them to be able to save the world. And that's a message I can more easily get behind. So yeah, amazing track regardless. Hearing it for the first time completely changed my perception of the band, and once again, it's probably the first track I would recommend to someone who has the image of the Moodies as nothing more than, like, some kind of lame soft rock or pop group. Anyway, the rest of this album sounds absolutely nothing like that. Everything else here pretty much reconfirms the band's reputation of being lame soft rockers, and the remaining 7 tracks are pretty much all the kind of cozy love songs and sappy emotional ballads that sold well in the early 70s. Seventh Sojourn was the final album in the band's classic era. The band at this point had started to get burnt out and would obviously follow this project with a temporary breakup and hiatus that ran through most of the rest of the 70s, as I already went over before. And even if this project still very much focuses on that classic psych rock and psych pop sound that they came up on, which I've always loved the most and is very well constructed to cohesively flow together, I do think that the band being burnt out does sort of show. A lot of these ballads kind of meander and don't land with as much impact as the best ballads on albums they'd released beforehand. In fact, when I first set this script down, I was fully expecting this to be the album I marked as my least favorite classic Moodies album. I have always struggled with this thing, perhaps out of I'm just a singer in a rock and roll band having set the completely wrong kind of expectations for me, and for years I could never fully get on board for this project as a complete whole. No joke, it wasn't until literally like 2 or 3 days ago when the rest of this album finally started to actually click with me enough where I realized I could bump it a spot above A Question of Balance. It was the most last-minute change to this script. I had to totally rewrite both segments when it dawned on me that was happening. Even with the easy joke of Seventh Sojourn ranking at number 7 just dangling right there in front of my face. Yeah, that only just came to pass, like, now. I will say, regardless of previous feelings, I did always have an easier time with the first side of the album and find all those tracks more easily memorable. Mike Pinder's opening track, Lost in a Lost World, has one of the denser and more evocative instrumentals, with lots of swirling faux orchestral instrumentation and a downbeat tune lamenting all the various bad things happening in the world, and feeling overwhelmed by all the war and social strife around them, which, boy, is that an unfortunately relevant mood for 2024. Or any of the past several years. I wish it wasn't as evergreen a mood as it was. I never had a hard time getting into that track from the first time I heard it. It's an excellent opener to this thing. I also always really liked Justin Hayward's romantic ballad that immediately follows, called New Horizons. is just really nice and cozy and has his usual really strong melodies and earnest and longing delivery that he can always consistently nail, especially in this era. And the very light string backing is just a bit of texture to let it go the extra mile. Everything else on this album was an acquired taste at best, though. For My Lady for a long time was my easy least favorite track to come out of the whole classic period of the Moodies, which, to be fair, is not necessarily saying much. I never hated it by any stretch. The medieval woodwinds and accordions aiding some other folksier instrumental textures add up to the kind of whimsical and extremely stereotypically British-sounding pop tune that Ray Thomas could be easily recognizable for writing in this era. It is certainly catchy, but it was never catchy in the good way for me. Like, this is the kind of track that if it gets stuck in my head is more likely to come off annoying and cloying more than anything. And it was written not too long after Ray Thomas got divorced, so it was basically meant as a song about like, hey ladies, I'm single and available now. It was so easy to imagine him like tipping his top hat or maybe even fedora to any lady who might be passing by while singing the song. That said, I guess if literally any band could make a track like this come off charming and genuine, it is the Moody Blues, and it is sold well enough where I could eventually warm up to it. And it's not even the most insidious earworm Ray Thomas ever wrote. We'll get to that later. Still probably my least favorite cut on the album, but it's fine. And I do really like how it transitions perfectly into Isn't Life Strange. And Isn't Life Strange itself is nice, makes for an effective sort of emotional centerpiece to the record, though it's also kind of emblematic of what made this album more difficult for me to connect with. The song is more than a little on the schmaltzy side, and the melodies can feel a little cliched in moments, even if the guitars during the choruses have a bit more muscle to them than most songs here. Very pretty song, I can easily remember what it sounds like, it was a pretty big hit, just never been a major favorite they've ever done either. The second side of this album, meanwhile, is where I always struggled the hardest, as the ballads would start to have a lot less of an actual hook to them. Tracks like You and Me, The Land of Make-Believe, and When You're a Free Man. Despite all the nice and pleasant and heartwarming vibes they created, they would disappear from my head immediately after they finished and just weren't catchy at all. It's the most meandering and formless stretch of the album, but these are also the tracks that finally started to click with me more as of a few days ago. You and Me is one of the most mid-tempo tracks in their classic era catalog, but in the context of this album it adds a bit of actual energy and pulse. The Land of Make-Believe lives up to the vibe you'd expect out of its title with all those twinkling little chime melodies, shows Justin Hayward writing a track as fluffy and whimsical as many Ray Thomas tracks tended to be. And When You're a Free Man was Pinder writing a tribute to Timothy Leary, who'd been arrested for marijuana possession around the time. Kind of takes things back into some darker and, well, moodier territory. We'll be getting into Timothy Leary's specific importance to this band more later. And then, as I already mentioned, I'm Just a Singer in a Rock and Roll Band fades in and gives the album an almost undeservedly explosive ending. Still really sticks out like a sore thumb in terms of having a way higher energy level than anything else on the album, but I suppose I will take it either way. It is still one of my favorite tracks of theirs. But yeah, that's everything on Seventh Sojourn. Bit of a bittersweet end to the band's classic period. All around very sweet and pleasant, even in its worst moments, with a few amazing individual tracks. It still sticks to that particular classic, well-textured faux symphonic style of the Moodies, which I've frankly always preferred over their later synth-pop style, and the album sounds great. I'm glad I eventually got to a point with this album where I could finally appreciate what it was doing as a complete whole. The vibe it does create is worth immersing yourself in, and it's much better constructed and better flowing as a full album than A Question of Balance was, even if that album doesn't meander nearly as much and has more of an actual pulse to it. That said, while I have come around on this album, if the amount of time this thing took to grow on me is any indication, I would absolutely not recommend this as your starting point to get into the band. Aside from the closer, and maybe the opener if you like. This one's much more for the already converted fans who already love their softer ballad-heavy side. And if you're a newcomer to the Moodies, this has the very easy potential to just come off dull instead. It has steadily grown on me from being just decent, but kind of a letdown on my first listen in college, to being really good now. But I still have to say they've got plenty of other albums that can hit me with much more immediacy and on a much deeper level in this, that feel like they have more bite to them than the somewhat aimless floatiness of this one. And as for an example of something with a little more bite, whoosh. At number 6, I have Long Distance Voyager. I know over the course of this video I haven't been the kindest to the band's 80s material, but there was obviously a good reason they kept trying at that sound for such a long time. Their first album in the 80s and their first album to have Patrick Moraz on board as their keyboardist wasn't just the start of a big second wind in terms of their commercial success, their second #1 album in the US with 2 Billboard Top 20 hits in The Voice and Gemini Dream, but it's also obviously easily the best of their 80s albums, a major return to form after the middling effort on their previous comeback attempt in Octave. Everything that Octave tried to be and failed finally succeeded on Long Distance Voyager. A modernizing of their sound that fit within the pop landscape of the time, but still maintained enough of their original appeal to not feel like a betrayal or sellout to their usual fans. Replacing much of their typical grandiose symphonic arrangements with comparatively more stripped-back synth-pop and pop-rock arrangements, with the rock-solid songwriting and rock-solid production to actually back it up. Now, the best songs on this thing are admittedly also just the biggest hits. The Voice is such a fantastically propulsive and spirit-lifting opener to this thing, probably my favorite track in the bunch, actual contender of being among my top 10 favorite tracks of theirs overall. And Gemini Dream might be up there as well. Probably the single most effective banger to come out of the band in this entire era. I don't know how to describe, but there's a kind of coolness and swagger to that one, which none of their other tracks have in the same way, but with a tune that's strongly composed enough to actually sell it and get it to feel natural. Comes off a little like their equivalent to ELO's Don't Bring Me Down or something. And also some of those bass synths give me a little bit of Herbie Hancock Chameleon vibes, which is neat. In between those two tracks is the less successful but still pretty successful third single, Talking Out of Turn, which is a bit quieter, more balladish, but still has all those squirting synth effects to make it feel more contemporary, still has one of the catchiest tunes on display here, and they even bring back some of the proper orchestral flares from their earlier work for this arrangement to make it feel grander and more moody bluesish. Goes on for 7 minutes without feeling like it at all. But unlike their other 80s albums, the deep cuts are all really solid as well, and there aren't any skips. If the weakest moment for me might be the 7-minute not really acoustic ballad In My World, then that is a good sign because that track is still good. And on the second side, we have more spirit-lifting and cheerful numbers like Meanwhile, or another really nice faux symphonic ballad in Nervous. But there's also another heavier banger from Graham Edge in between them called 22,000 Days, about how life is short and you should make the most of it. There's some shouting choruses on that one, which I guess make that track the closest they came to recapturing the weird one-off success of Steppin' in a Slide Zone. And Ray Thomas comes in for an entire 3-part mini-suite at the end, including Painted Smile, a track about how it's hard to be a jester with all the carnivalish instrumentation to back it up, a quick 30-second spoken word passage on Reflective Smile, delivered by Dave Simmons now that Mike Pinder isn't around to do it anymore. And finally, veteran Cosmic Rocker acting as the album's most over-the-top and theatrical banger, living up to the grandiosity of its title. This whole mini-suite at the end sounds like it'd get to be a bit much on paper, but it goes by so damn quickly. Those 3 tracks at the end only total up to about 7 minutes. And there's 2 individual tracks earlier on the album that are that long without feeling like it. This whole suite at the end ends up adding this little welcome taste of weirder artsiness that just wasn't present in the vast majority of their later period albums. Okay, in retrospect, The Present might have technically had more moments that got that little bit weirder and artsier, but this album just obviously has better songwriting to back it up and is a far more immediate listen. All around, yeah, Long Distance Voyager just holds up as a really strong album front to back. Your mileage may vary on how much the album's success worked to the band's benefit in the long run, given how they'd capitalize on it later, but at least in this one case, all of it effectively works for what it's going for. I just don't really have anything to complain about here. There's not a single track that isn't at least good, and it's the only 80s Moody Blues album with enough quality to properly go toe-to-toe with their 60s and early 70s classics, and that I can definitively recommend you check out if you haven't heard it. Whoosh. At number 5, I have Every Good Boy Deserves Favor. Alright, now it's finally time to get into all the big classics that I hold the closest to me. One could definitely argue that this was the most pop-friendly the band had gotten in this era of their career, and even if this obviously isn't in even close to the same tier of poppiness as anything they did in the 80s, I suppose I would get it if this wasn't to everyone's taste. We haven't yet gotten to their first 4 really big cosmic and/or spiritual epics. However, out of those last 3 more straightforward albums in their original classic era run of 7, this is easily my favorite of them, and it's not particularly close. Part of that is just a nostalgia thing, and the fact that this was the third album from the band I ever got the chance to hear in full after checking out the CD from the library, and thus it's been in my life for a longer time than other albums of theirs from the same era, such as A Question of Balance. But even with that in mind, I do think the pop songwriting on this album is markedly sharper than it was on A Question of Balance or Seventh Sojourn. There are several tracks here that have gotten stuck in my head for days at a time in the good way. Not to say every track hits me as strongly as the next. I've always been a lot more drawn to the first side of this album than the second side. The way this thing starts with the band's single most out there experimental track ever in Procession is already one heck of a way to kick things off. Creating this freeform and abstract representation of the history of music itself through somewhat disconnected musical passages ranging from sparse synth percussion symbolizing prehistoric times to Indian ragas to medieval harpsichords. Not to mention various sound effects and the entire band dramatically shouting words like desolation, creation, communication. It's some truly wild shit that's unlike anything else the band ever made, but from there they transition right into 4 of my favorite pop-leaning tracks they've ever made, including what many people could and have argued is the best pop song they've ever made full stop, The Story in Your Eyes. Just this super punchy and propulsive pop rock groove with all the big vocal harmonies and mellotrons following Hayward's especially strong tune, super straightforward and to the point, clocking in at less than 3 minutes, but leaving so much of an impact so as to occasionally be considered one of the best songs of the whole era. And I can't disagree with its reputation either. It's probably sitting somewhere in my own top 5 tracks from them as well. Our Guessing Game is probably the least memorable track on the first side, but it's still an excellent little tune as well, and the way all the vocal harmonies stack up and layer over each other is pretty dang impressive sounding. Emily's Song is the single cutest track to ever come out of the band, written as a very literal lullaby by John Lodge to his newborn daughter. And it's just so low-key and simple but incredibly heartwarming, where if you're unable to at least crack a smile at it, I have to assume you don't have a heart at all. And then finally, the first side finishes with one last more energetic and rocking number called After You Came, which I've always thought was really underrated. The hooks on that one keep bouncing all over the place and going in a bunch of different directions, but they all effectively link together and make for a really fun listening experience as well. This whole first side of the album is amazing. I love all those tracks. The second side of the album is merely pretty solid and doesn't have any of my absolute biggest favorites from the band, kinda returning to the level of quality A Question of Balance and Seventh Sojourn has sit around for me. Also kind of leaning away from the really strong hooks that the first side focused on with more generally meandering ballads again. Well, there is one more track with a really strong hook, although it's one I have much more mixed feelings on, and that's Nice to Be Here. This is Ray Thomas's typical interjection of a more whimsical idea, and quite handily the most whimsical idea he ever came up with for the Moodies, which should really be saying something given the tracks he contributed to other albums I have higher up in this ranking. Guy is literally describing a scene out of a Disney movie of all the animals in the woods meeting up to play a song together, birds singing, bees buzzing in harmony, a mouse plays a daffodil. These are actual lyrics. And the result is quite possibly the absolute most insidiously unkillable earworm in the band's entire repertoire, not unlike the songs that actually show up in the classic Disney movies the song evokes. I mean, the tune behind this one is better and easier to like on the surface than something like For My Lady. Doesn't hit as much of a weird conflicting note for me, and sometimes can even fully live up to its title, especially if I haven't listened to the album in a long time. But being even significantly catchier means that if this does get stuck in my head and I'm not in the mood for it, that track has the potential to absolutely drive me up the freaking wall, and the power of its hook tends to make me less likely to want to put it on. The remaining tracks are all very solid, if not necessarily outstanding. One More Time to Live kind of shows John Lodge reconfiguring the shouting vocals from the opener into more of an actual song rather than an experimental piece. That goes over pretty well, makes the album feel like that much more of a holistic experience. You Can Never Go Home is a nice Justin Hayward ballad that doesn't really have much of a hook, but that still generally hits the emotional note it's going for. I don't tend to remember that one easily, but I do enjoy it in the moment. But the best track on the second side by some distance has to be Mike Pinder's Closer, My Song. This one also doesn't have the strongest of hooks, and as such was never much of a standout when I was first getting into the band. But it is probably the grandest arrangement on the album, with various keyboard and mellotron passages that have a bit of a classical-inspired flavor. That one probably hits on the deepest emotional note of any track on the album, even if it's definitely not one of the more immediate ones. It's grown on me a lot while I've worked on this video. And that's Every Good Boy Deserves Favor. A lot of great stuff to be found here, and lots of tracks I hold very close to me. maybe a bit uneven in spots, but very much in the middle of the Moody's creative peak and delivering some of their very best work. And while we're on the topic of the band's creative peak, let's finally get into those biggest and most ambitious creative heights, shall we? Whoopsh. At number 4, I have In Search of the Lost Chord. When I was in high school and first really getting into the Moody Blues, I checked out 2 CDs of theirs from the library near my house, one of Days of Future Past and one of this album. They were the first 2 projects I'd ever heard from these guys in full. And initially, when I first heard both of them, I gravitated more towards this one as my favorite, and it stayed that way for a pretty long time. It felt like it had more sonic variety and more creativity on display, and the best tracks felt like they had more of an edge to them or were a bit punchier. And while that's still true, and I still love the album, nowadays I'll admit this one's shrunk on me a little. It's the least consistent of the first 4 peak period projects, with some moments on this thing hitting way more than others. A couple of the absolute best tracks they've ever made, sharing space with a couple of tracks that are merely pretty good. As well as being more clearly and obviously dated, the kind of project that you'd really only see within this period in the late 60s. It's a concept album about a journey to find spiritual enlightenment. And while LSD is never explicitly mentioned, even as a kid I knew exactly what induced that journey. It really doesn't take a genius to figure out, especially with the one track directly about Timothy Leary. But in contrast to an album like Pink Floyd's The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which paints a vivid picture of the downsides to taking LSD and how that drug can fuck you up, In Search of the Lost Chord tries to showcase the best case scenario to what dropping acid can do to you, really romanticizing it and showing it in a very pleasant and comforting light. I don't know of any other album off the top of my head that made LSD sound more appealing than In the Search of the Lost Chord does. Tracks like Voices in the Sky, showing Justin Hayward at one with nature and talking with the birds, feeling genuine joy at the peace that surrounds him. The Best Way to Travel, showing Mike Pinder excitedly telling you about flying and traveling at the speed of light with your own imagination. Or John Lodge delivering arguably the best track in the opener Ride My Seesaw. That shows the Moody's more properly rocking out over their excitement for the psychedelic adventures they're about to embark upon. They're all such instant and effortless mood brighteners. But at the same time, they're not trying to hide the stakes or danger which may come with such a drug-induced spiritual journey. A track like House of Four Doors shows more of an austere air of imposing mystery, as they take you on a journey through each of the titular doors, loudly creaking open into new instrumental passages for new rooms, then revealing in the track's part 2 later on that the 4th door just leads right back to where they started. It loops infinitely. You could be lost there forever. And in between those 2 tracks is the above-mentioned track about Timothy Leary, the 6.5-minute album centerpiece, Legend of a Mind, which ostensibly acts as a tribute to all the man's philosophies and explorations across the astral plane, complete with flute and mellotron solos which are absolutely freaking beautiful. Although, the track's very first and most recognizable line is, "Timothy Leary's dead." The whole track, while paying tribute to him, is oddly framed as like a eulogy to his memory. Even though, fun fact, Timothy Leary was not dead when this album released. He didn't die until 1996. While I was reading through the Wikipedia page, it had the theory that the lines about Leary's death were meant to be about ego death and transcendental out-of-body experiences, which, I mean, that would absolutely track. Like, he's not dead, he's just outside looking in. But my dad always had the theory that this track being framed as Leary's eulogy was also kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of them highlighting the downsides of his teachings. That the track actually had a very subtle anti-drug message about how traveling too far could get you lost. And considering its specific placement on the album with the immediately following track whose hook is "You'll Be Lost There Forever," I think there's at least some merit to that interpretation as well. Whichever way you decide to take their message, that track is another one of the absolute best and most impressive tracks they've ever made. Not sure whether I like Legend of a Mind more than Ride My Seesaw, depends on my mood, I suppose. Now, there have been other moments on this album that haven't stood up as well, or I was never really that big on to begin with, especially on the second side. My least favorite track on the album has always been Visions of Paradise. And that one is a nice, pleasant little ballad about, well, what the title says. It's a solid little moment of inner peace, still good for what it is, but it always felt too musically barren in one note for my liking, and the initial tune never progresses in any meaningful way beyond where it starts. They've got lots of other better tracks with this kind of similar idea. The closer, was never a massive favorite either, although I do respect that one a lot more since it's pretty much the most thematically appropriate way this album could have ended, revealing the album's titular lost chord to be about the Hindi concept of the supreme absolute, the divine force of energy, heaven, the destination at which the search described by the album is meant to culminate in. And the track does have that overt Indian influence, with all the sitars joining in and getting a whole little breakdown to themselves at one point. Though it is also a track that almost entirely centers itself around one major chord without changing much at all over its 5.5-minute running time. Again, thematically appropriate, but there's almost no sense of movement here aside from that one part where the tempo gets a little faster. Like Visions of Paradise, it's very stationary within its one idea and doesn't make for the most exciting track on display here. There's also Dr. Livingstone, I presume, which, while I like, is a bit of an odd moment for the album. It's a cheery little tune about the great explorers they were taught about in school, like David Livingstone, Captain Robert Falcon Scott, and Christopher Columbus, and questioning whether in their journeys they really found what they were looking for, kind of demystifying their journey as you can accomplish all these supposedly grand celebrated things and still not find that something you've been looking for in life. Why yes, Ray Thomas did write this one, how did you know? For the record, he doesn't write only playful kiddie-sounding tunes. Legend of a Mind was his song too. But 9 times out of 10, if there is any playful kiddie-sounding tune on a Moody's album, it's going to be his. I will say Dr. Livingstone, I presume, did hit a weird note upon initial revisit, as I mistakenly thought this track was just supposed to be celebrating those explorers, all of whom the accomplishments of seem questionable at best in the grander scheme of history. Livingstone being a missionary who went out to spread the good news of Christianity through Africa and carry out the white man's burden, as it were. Scott being a naval captain who went out on an expedition to Antarctica to find the South Pole but got lost and died. And Columbus, who of course is best known for showing up to the wrong continent, claiming this area that had people living there already for his country, and leading a bunch of genocides of the natives and stuff. Sure you want to be likening your own spiritual journeys to such exploits, guys? Quite possibly the single starkest reminder of this band's unignorable whiteness, which should really be saying something given the existence of the entire Denny Lane era. Though, given the song is ruminating specifically on those explorers' failures to find what they were looking for and lightheartedly questioning their greatness, I'll let them have it. In any case, that track is another one of the biggest earworms they've ever come up with, and I still would have said I enjoy it regardless, even if not as a major favorite. This whole album has so much childhood nostalgia attached to it. I know it like the back of my hand, and again, the best moments are some of the best tracks in their whole career. If it wasn't obvious from how long I've been rambling about it, we've officially gotten to the stuff that I specifically made this video hoping to nerd out over. This is an absolutely fascinating listen with so many clever ideas to unpack and think about. I didn't even mention The Actor. That's a great song too, that's just as theatrical as it probably sounds. I still hold this as a classic and one of their absolute best, but out of their first 4 peak period albums, this is the one where I feel like I can most easily see its flaws. At the end of the day, they have other projects with an equal amount of quality much more consistently spread across all tracks and end up stronger as a result. For instance, whoosh. At number 3, I have On the Threshold of a Dream. Right, this was their first album to go all the way to number 1 in the UK despite not having any hit singles, and I have to say, that's wholly deserved. So, you know how there's this little album from 1969 that tends to get decently well remembered by history? This little project called In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson? A lot of fans of that one. It's this really strange but really creative mix of harder rock styles with symphonic stylings, aided by mellotrons and various other instrumentation with a bit of a foreboding and fantastical medieval theme backing up the whole thing. You know that one? Imagine an album like that if it were a lighthearted feel-good listen with more of like a fluffier pop-friendly focus, and you get On the Threshold of a Dream. Also, this album predates In the Court of the Crimson King by a few months. The Moodies got to this sound first. The lyrics on this album admittedly don't matter as much as they did on the previous 2 Moody's albums or their next one. They kind of tend to more generically talk about life and love and that kind of stuff, and there's no overarching theme or concept to tie it together like that. But just the sound of everything is absolutely stellar. Everything from those late 60s pop rock grooves to the vocal harmonies to all the grander instrumental accompaniment from flutes to strings to more mellotron. It all sounds grand and epic and fantastical, but also really really puts you in a good mood. Each track feels like it adds something specific to the table without any of them feeling any more or less important than any other. Tracks can range quite a bit in energy, either delivering uplifting and peppy and energetic pop rock numbers like Lovely to See You, Send Me No Wine, or To Share Our Love, all of which have really strong hooks and everyone singing really sells their performance and sounds like they're having a lot of fun, all some of the absolute best cuts in the bunch. There's also some lower key moments that allow them to get a little stranger and more out of the box, be it on the esoteric and downbeat Dear Diary, or the simultaneous contentment and odd listless spookiness behind a track like Lazy Day. The verses about kicking back to watch TV and having a satisfying filling dinner, contrasting with the much eerier wordless chorus, is odd but intriguing, and once again is one of the biggest earworms in the bunch. Ray Thomas did have a particular knack for that kind of thing. Also shoutouts to Are You Sitting Comfortably, which is basically a better version of Visions of Paradise on the last album, with more of a medieval fantasy flavor replacing that track's vaguely Indian-inspired flavor. Or the more sci-fi leaning spoken word passages behind the interlude The Dream, or the intro In the Beginning, which is all about Descartes' I think, therefore I am philosophy, and wanting to be more than the magnetic ink to be used by the establishment, urging the listener to keep cool and face piles of trials with smiles. Always loved how off-the-wall and goofy, but simultaneously cool that intro sounded. But there's even bigger and more interesting highlights than those. Never Comes the Day is the album's only single, which is a bit of an odd choice if you ask me, but it is a fan favorite and very much deserves to be. A combination of the super low-key stripped-back ballad in the verses, which is so quiet that Justin Hayward is almost whispering, but it builds up into this romantic and cosmic trip in the chorus with all these bright synth pads and harmonicas coming together surprisingly effectively. And Mike Pinder delivers the album's two most epic moments, closing out side one with So Deep Within You, a playful soul-adjacent cut that, in place of a chorus, has the super epic instrumental riff with flutes and timpanis. Do-do-do-do, do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Another strange idea, but one that again comes together more effectively than you might expect. Also, in a bit of a turnaround from the band's origins covering R&B artists, the legendary Motown group The Four Tops ended up covering this song a few years later, and their version also kicks ass, worth looking up if you haven't heard it. And of course there's Pinder's big epic finisher, Have You Heard? The core of the track, labeled as Have You Heard Part 1 and 2, are kinda just an ordinary sounding ballad with a little bit of cello accompaniment, and generally maintaining the cheerful tone of the rest of the album, expressing hope and wonder and optimism for living life. But bridging the gap between the two parts is a 4-minute instrumental passage called The Voyage, which, man, if there is any one track in existence that made me most fall in love with the sound of the mellotron, it is this one. The fake strings sound so huge and expansive, and the classical piano and other orchestral flourishes have so much dramatic weight, and it goes so damn hard. One of the coolest sounding sections of any Moody Blues album. There's not a single miss to be found throughout the entire track listing of this album. All of it totally nails the uplifting mood it's going for, and is so consistently interesting and fun to listen to. I have no idea why it isn't more well remembered than it already is, and it's absolutely one of the first albums I'd recommend for people looking to first get into the Moody Blues and discover what they're all about. But as consistently great as this album is, only a few months later they put out another album that I think ended up topping it, so why don't we get into that? Whoopsh. At number 2, I have To Our Children's Children's Children. You know, this was one of the worst selling projects the Moodies put out in this era, which isn't too surprising when you really think about it. Not only did they only ever ship one single to radio, Watching and Waiting, which in itself is one of their most understated tracks up to that point, and lacked the kind of strong hook that made Nights in White Satin as popular as it was. The kind of thing that works better in the context of an album, but maybe doesn't stand on its own as well. But not only that, you get to the album itself, and it's a space-themed concept inspired by the moon landing in 1969. Space may be one of those themes that, if not handled a certain way, can end up rather silly and not as easy to take seriously, especially when being explored through rock and pop music, making an otherwise corny band come off even cornier, or a pretentious band even more pretentious and start to lose people. Just ask Coldplay how it went for them. But space makes for a great fit for the Moodies in this era as a natural extension of their last two albums being about finding spiritual enlightenment, now translating to a journey out into the most literal infinite unknown, delivering it in a way that is both easy to understand and pick up on from a distance, but also loose enough where you could ignore the concept altogether and be sold on the music without needing to know any of the context. Approached with as much genuine sincerity as they always do. The first side of the album takes the space themes in a more literal direction, most unignorably on my personal favorite track here, the opener Higher and Higher, which has them mimicking the sound of a rocket taking off and leaving the atmosphere with the mellotron and other effects, but smoothly transitioning into one of their single most propulsive and energetic rockers ever, complete with epic spoken word about the new frontier that humanity has reached. I think that's the second hardest hitting track they've made, behind I'm Just a Singer in a Rock and Roll Band, and the first time I got to hear that was nothing short of mind-blowing. Graham Edge's instrumental cut Beyond is also awesome in the same way, the way all the banging percussion and soaring melodic riffs just wrap around and get hard panned to the left and right, really furthering that feeling of zooming out into the outer reaches of the galaxies at high speed. But there's also tracks from Mike Pinder like Out and In and Sun is Still Shining, which just kind of admire the expansiveness of the universe from a distance over much sweeter instrumentals, the latter bringing back some of those sitars for that extra psychedelic sound. There's Ray Thomas's typical interjection of whimsy and floating, imagining how much fun it would be to walk on the moon in low gravity, but he also delivers a much more serious-sounding spin on a similar musical idea, resulting in Eternity Road, obviously directly about traveling through the infinity and featuring some of the band's most memorably pretty vocal harmonies. But literal space travel is only half of the equation on this album. The other half of the album explores the theme of infinity in a less literal sense, or evokes the emotions of loneliness that would be felt on such a journey through the infinite, especially in the second side. Justin Hayward delivers two interludes in I Never Thought I'd Live to Be 100 or I Never Thought I'd Live to Be a Million, exploring the passage of time from the perspective of some kind of work of art that's still remembered after such long periods of time, hence why the album is titled the way it is. Imagining this album as a sort of time capsule that could hopefully echo through the ages. It is a shame that one of the tracks on this album is titled a Romani slur, which might prevent this album from being able to effectively echo through the ages as well as they were hoping. Especially unfortunate, as said track is my very easy favorite of Hayward's tracks here, as well as what quickly became the fan favorite of the album. I mean, if there's one track that would have probably made the most sense to act as the lead single in hindsight, it's probably that one. Not only is it one of the more energetic tracks with arguably the single strongest hook here, but god, the way the mellotrons just envelop the sound of this one and go up against all their dense vocal harmonies to evoke being forever hopelessly lost in that vast infinity. It's very dark and bleak, but oddly approachable through how expansive and cinematic the sound is. I'd understand if it made people uncomfortable, but I'd be lying if I said I'd ever be able to resist it myself. And I already mentioned Watching and Waiting. I only really like that song and don't consider it a major favorite for reasons kind of alluded to earlier, but it is worth noting that Justin Hayward has gone on record calling that one of his personal favorite tracks he's ever made, if not just his favorite overall. Able to hit upon levels of emotion and conjure imagery in his head that can't be matched by any other Moody's track, and I definitely get it. His yearning for human connection, as if he's unsure he'll ever get to see another human again, does make for a particularly powerful, emotional heavy hitter to effectively close the album out. And that leaves John Lodge's tracks. His two-parter Eyes of a Child is neat, having this loose and bouncy track about innocence and your place in the universe being repurposed into a more energetic and propulsive track with almost the same lyrics in the second part. But the real showstopper he delivered is Candle of Life. This track is the one that hits the biggest emotional note on the album for me by a long shot. Another track about the passage of time and loneliness, how insignificant and short all our lives are, and how we ought to love everybody and make them our friends. Very simple idea, but given so much weight by all these dramatic piano and mellotron string progressions that are absolutely heart-wrenching, another massive all-timer for me in the Moody's catalog. There is not a single skip or weak track on this album. All of them, including the interludes, add something special as substance, and the album feels like more than just the sum of its parts. It may be weird to say, but I think this is the closest they came to genuine coolness for me. The cosmic theming gave them even more emotional gravity, no pun intended, and it came with that further expansion and instrumental scope to match. This and On the Threshold of a Dream are the two albums I'd most easily recommend to someone looking to get into the Moody Blues for the first time. The ones that really demonstrate what they ought to really be remembered for. And between those two, this is definitely the one I hold closer to me. It's such an overlooked classic, and in fact there was a pretty long time where I would have considered this my number one favorite without question. Although, I eventually started to realize that there was another album of theirs that could hit on an even deeper personal level, which I'd held close to me for longer than I'd even heard To Our Children's Children's Children, and only got deeper as I got older. And it's the obvious one you probably already thought it was, but let's talk about it. At number 1, I have Days of Future Past. Call this a basic pick if you want. This album is already consistently praised to the high heavens, and this band has lots of other albums that I can see why other people would think they improved upon the formulas this album set down. But not only do I think the way this album's concept is executed is pretty much completely flawless, not only do I love every single track on this thing, it's had a level of personal resonance formative to my entire life that very few albums in existence can really compare to. Hell, if I considered an album like this to fall within my typical reviewing format and I were to give it a numerical score, when I really thought about it, I didn't feel like I would have any reason not to score Days of Future Past a perfect 10 out of 10. And anyone who regularly follows my channel knows I am way pickier with what gets that honor than I think most people are. Only 5 other albums I've heard in my entire life so far have I publicly gone on record to call 10s. I wasn't sure whether or not this would hold that honor before, but there's been a time for each of my other 10s when I wasn't sure and felt like it was technically a small step away, and I couldn't think of a good enough reason to say that this wouldn't be when I hold it this ridiculously close to me on such a deep personal level, and I can't even think of the slightest nitpicks to level at it. It may be a simple concept record about, well, a day, each track corresponding to a specific time of day, and directly written about said time of day, dawn, morning, noon, afternoon, evening, and night. But not only is each of these songs written to be ridiculously catchy and memorable, but also feel like they completely embody each of these times a day as a concept, to the point where just thinking about the time of day can get some of these songs to pop into my head on a dime. If someone even so much as mentions the word Tuesday, I will immediately think of Tuesday afternoon, for instance. Not only are all these tracks so earnest and likable, I can think many a day where every track would be looping through my head during the time of day they correspond to, and I would still never get sick of them. I have a memory of going out on a trip to a Boy Scout summer camp for a week when I was a teenager, and I had this entire album looping through my head for nearly the entire week uninterrupted, partially on purpose. I also remember being a little disappointed at how short the time between sunset and night corresponding to twilight would be, since twilight time goes so damn hard. And I feel like that's just the surface level, the fact that even if you strip away the concept and the grander psychedelic pretensions, you'd still have a fantastic 60s pop record. The hooks and songwriting and melodies are just so incomparably great on a baseline level. But this album feels like it goes so far beyond that, and all of these tracks are given so much more emotional weight through the full-on live orchestral sections from Peter Knight placed in between each track. So well-textured, full of dynamic range, and ready-made to soundtrack non-existent sections of Disney's Fantasia. This isn't an album just about a typical day. It feels like it's a much deeper metaphor for life itself, each track corresponding to a time during your life, from birth to childhood, to your peak hour, to your older age, to your inevitable death. And all the vocal performances carry this deep sense of nostalgic wistfulness and warm empathy for all things good and bad in the world, melancholic longing for another time you cannot have, lonely men crying for love but have none, senior citizens wishing they were young. Fuck, did I mention the Graham Edge poems and the gong crashes that bookend the album so perfectly that they seem to even further the scale of the album as if it were about the birth, life, and death of the universe itself? The late lament section at the end of Nights in White Satin is the most capital F final note of closure any album in existence could possibly end on. Without question, the most emotionally affecting any spoken word passage in any album has ever been for me. It almost feels like you've died peacefully yourself with that last gong. My mom has told me she used to be scared of hearing Nights in White Satin when she was a kid for that exact reason. Now, while I'm on that note, there are certainly valid reasons to not put this album at the very obvious top spot, and I would get it if this isn't for everyone. I could see the album's grand pretensions or sheer whimsicality being a turnoff for some. especially with the absolute suffocatingly overwhelming Britishness of a track like Another Morning. Ew, what's a day to go kite flying? Cool, blimey, that'd be brilliant, isn't it? It's so British it borders on self-parody. Take a wild guess who wrote that track, by the way. This album is very obviously the product of a bunch of Brits discovering LSD for the first time in its heyday in 1967. Maybe that's not your cup of tea, as it were, but and if you find the results to reach a level of earnestness that you found corny, sure, that might make sense. Even if, again, for me, the sheer earnestness and complete lack of any irony or attempts at coolness is absolutely key to how it reached the level of resonance with me that it did. This album never comes off self-impressed to me, like, they're just poetically ruminating on the truth of life itself. And the presence of those cornier moments just served to make the album feel even more emotionally vulnerable to me. The album never feels like they're trying to elevate themselves to something bigger, it feels like they're trying to make something bigger than themselves. And even if it is a product of its time, it also has a sense of timelessness similar to the classic Disney movies it unintentionally evokes. Like, these are just songs that have existed since the beginning of time. I would totally get it if this required a certain mood for you to enjoy, if maybe the concept and grand pretensions got to be too overbearing for you like they did for my mom. Even if for me as a kid I tended to take all these tracks as more literally about their times a day and have a more carefree fun time with the album before the deeper meaning started to unlock more as I got older. And even if my own 10 out of 10 feelings come from a very specifically personal place, I'll also admit that this album hasn't even always been at the top of this ranking since I first got the idea to make this video. The 3 projects they followed it with, and that I have ranked directly below this one, have high points just as high as the best individual moments of this one, if not even higher sometimes, and with even more of them. There's easy cases to be made for all of those as their best work. But for those albums, it's mainly individual tracks that mean really special things to me. Days of Future Past as a complete unbroken whole means more to me than any of the individual tracks on it. And it needs to be taken as an unbroken whole. It's the album of theirs I've listened to the most over the years. It's the album I've thought about the most. It's the album that soundtracked the biggest chunks of my life as a kid, as an adult, and as I grow even older. This album has a truly eternal quality to it that even my other 10 out of 10s don't quite have to the same extent. Aside from maybe the second half of Orbital's Insides, and that's evoking eternity in a completely different way. This is an album that in its meditation on time completely transcends time in every way, at least for me. So for that, and for all the years, both in the past and in the future, that I'll be spending with it, I felt like there was no other more fitting choice for this album to go than in the #1 spot as my favorite Moody Blues album. And that is finally it. That's the ranking. Wow, that was a lot. I've been recording for like the entire day. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list? Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.